Greetings, everyone. This is Joyce Davis, and I'm President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. And tonight we kick off our annual Great Decisions discussion series for 2021. And all of this is thanks to the generous support of the Frederickson Library. World Affairs Councils around the country are sponsoring these Great Decisions discussions to help their communities better understand some of the most pressing issues of our day. We kick off our discussion tonight with a discussion that couldn't be more timely: the global supply chain and national security. And to lead us in that discussion, we have Dr. Ori Finkel of the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C., and our moderator will be Russell W. Goodman. He is a former editor-in-chief of Supply Chain Brain and a member of our board of directors. Now, if you are not a member of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, we invite you to go to our website at wacharrisburg.org and join tonight. And now, sit back, relax, and watch this mini documentary produced by the Foreign Policy Association. At the end of the film, Russell Goodman will introduce our discussion leader for her remarks before what we hope will be a lively Q&A. Get your questions ready. Stay tuned.
Assembled in China. That's what it says on the box of the latest iPhone. But the full story is more complicated. Korean batteries, Japanese cameras, Taiwanese chips, German accelerometers, Congolese minerals, all pieced together in China and sold around the world. The globalization of supply chains has made manufacturing more efficient and consumer goods cheaper. But what happens when a crisis hits? Great Decisions explores the interconnected web of the modern economy, investigates the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on international trade, and asks whether the age of economic globalization might be coming to an end. Global supply chains and national security. Next time on Great Decisions.
We will have to get the actual video. Just hang tight. I will try to find that for us.
Assembled in China, caught hospitals unprepared.
I ain't seen nothing like this before in my life.
By April, with supplies dwindling, doctors and nurses around the country were rationing gowns and reusing face masks.
Our index case was March 1st. We knew by March 10th that we were going to be in significant trouble. We did not anticipate the profound disruption of the supply chain from China, where most of these masks came from. And as a consequence of that, we didn't just have a momentary disruption, we had a profound life-threatening disruption in our ability to procure supplies.
Widespread shortages of medical equipment called popular attention to just how much the American medical system relies on international trade.
Countries specialize in different types of equipment. Some of them export a lot of generic medicines like India and China, and protective equipment like masks or garments that help protect the healthcare workers. Those are mostly produced in China and Malaysia.
The pandemic has exacerbated long-standing concerns about how much the American economy relies on supply chains that pass through China.
We're clearly going through a period where people feel very vulnerable, and given the trade tensions with China, the U.S. is very sensitive about being reliant on China for any product or service at this point.
There's a very good reason why people started buying things from China. That was, you could go there and order anything in large quantities and get it relatively quickly. And that will be very difficult and expensive to undo.
Now, policymakers from both parties agree that the federal government must take action to secure critical supply chains.
There is a strong need for us to have reliability in our supply chain so we can take care of our own citizens should there be other health emergencies like this. And sadly, we can predict with near certainty that there will be other health emergencies like this.
Most nations that can will protect fundamental things like food supply, like medicine. Not every nation has that opportunity, but we do in the United States.
The man who changed the global economy forever was a truck driver from North Carolina named Malcolm McLean. In 1956, McLean experimented with a new way to move cargo directly between trucks and ships, stacked efficiently and never needing to be repacked. The modern shipping container was born.
This cargo is going into a steel container called a cargo van. The cargo vans are proving especially useful in the safe shipment of small cargo that's more susceptible to pilferage or damage in handling.
It was actually the evolution and the introduction of the shipping container that fundamentally transformed and lowered by an order of magnitude the cost of shipping and transportation of goods all over the world.
Almost the entire post-war period up until the early 2000s was a golden time for international trade. Deeper engagement in international trade yielded a tremendous growth.
In the 1990s, the digital revolution spurred globalization still further. Increasingly, it was possible to manage far-flung operations over the internet.
The digital revolution created modern global value chains because with computer technologies and the falling costs of communications, it became possible for companies to break up production to maximize both cost efficiency and quality by locating wherever in the world made the most sense.
So for example, Bombardier is a Canadian plane maker, and they make parts of their business jets in central Mexico, and the rest they make in Quebec. And before the internet, there was no way they could make the tails in Mexico and the rest of the plane in Canada and hope they would fit together when you were trying to coordinate this with airmail letters and faxes.
I believe that this pandemic is going to leave us with several lessons. One is that there's greater risk to have all your employees in one place. And number two is you can achieve good efficiency because of the advances in technology, connectivity, use of the web, use of the cloud.
As the 21st century dawned, the patterns of international trade were transformed by the controversial decision to integrate China into the global economy.
In opening the economy of China, the agreement will create unprecedented opportunities for American farmers, workers, and companies.
It's the Democratic caucus of the House of Representatives that voted overwhelmingly against granting most favored nation status to China. At that time, the business interests that were for it said that granting that status would increase our trade deficit by only $1 billion a year. They were off by 30,000%.
Products are made abroad for a reason. It tends to be more efficient to do that, and we benefit enormously as consumers. You know, the cost of the things we consume has come down dramatically over the last 4 or 5 decades. But I think it is fair to say that trade competition is one of the things that has contributed to a decline in manufacturing in the United States.
Today, those who have watched the integration of the global economy most closely warn that the genie of globalization, once let out of the bottle, would be impossible to put back in.
If the U.S. just suddenly tried to dramatically decouple from China by cutting off all supplies, it's not going to work. Nobody has the manufacturing capacity that China does today, and U.S. consumers are going to pay a very heavy price if we try to sever those ties.
Historically speaking, the supply chains were made cost-effective over time. It's a natural evolution, and it's not going to disappear.
As calls for the reshoring of key industries ramp up, experts warn that policymakers must proceed with caution.
We need to be careful and thoughtful about which sectors of the economy we would like to bring home to the United States.
I think it goes back to what are the things you couldn't live without? I think certainly medicine and medical supplies would be one of them. I certainly think food is one of them. And I think energy is also one of them.
With the memory of the acute shortages from the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic still fresh, many stakeholders insist that the U.S. government should use its national security powers to promote domestic manufacture of medical equipment.
We need a national strategic plan on that. I feel very strongly that, based on this experience, that there needs to be a renewed emphasis on domestic manufacturing, period. That is a vital interest to this country, and I would say is a national security interest.
We do have a precedent in the country for demanding that certain supply chains of critical material be made in the United States. So, for example, we don't manufacture weapon systems in other nations unless they're allies. We won't manufacture them in adversary nations. We won't buy them from adversaries. We've never defined medical equipment as a critical national security supply chain, but I think the pandemic has demonstrated that we have to rethink that.
The United States is one of the biggest producers of medical equipment in the world. The US, Germany, and Switzerland are the 3 biggest exporters in the world. The production comes from different places, depending on the product. Now, I think the problem is if everybody wants to manufacture everything domestically, that's simply not doable.
The pandemic has also raised questions about how reliably Americans can access vital medicines in a time of crisis.
The big concern is that some critical sort of key ingredients that go into certain patent medicines, and those ingredients are sourced on a bulk basis within China. As a result of perhaps trade friction, there's been some restriction in terms of the availability of these feedstocks from Chinese factories. And thus, we're starting to see, for certain types of medicines, shortages at retail pharmacies.
It's not just the manufacturing of the products themselves, but it's actually the containers in which these products will be shipped to us, the glass vials, the syringes, etc., for which demand has clearly already outstripped supply. It's also really hard to make these products de novo and in short order.
But some experts warn that those who champion self-sufficiency should be mindful of the painful lessons learned by other countries that have tried to control their domestic food supplies.
I'll give you an example. Argentina wanted to protect its beef, and they didn't want their agricultural sector to be exporting beef and making all this money while locals could not find beef. The Argentine beef business is smaller. They are not producing to full capacity. It is less profitable. Some people are going out of business.
In the British case, one of the great pushes for national self-sufficiency after 1945 came in food. The United Kingdom was unique amongst the large countries in the world in that it imported something like half its food. Now, that was thought to be dangerous in the eyes of many people.
Playing a magnificent part in restocking our larders, New Zealand is going all out to send every possible ton of meat to Britain. Records are made and broken as the food drive goes on, and it isn't only meat. Thousands of tons of New Zealand butter and apples are also filling the holds.
Through protection, through investment, the output of food increased very dramatically, such that by the 1980s, the United Kingdom was essentially self-sufficient. So the result actually was that British people ended up eating relatively expensive food, and really only the sort of food that you could grow in this country. So I don't think it was especially good for the British diet that we had self-sufficiency in the 1970s and 1980s.
For economists and policymakers, the most concerning supply chains are those that feed high-tech manufacturing, a sector where countries around the world often rely on components produced in China.
The more challenging issue and the more difficult issue is not PPE or masks. It's sort of what to do with some of these, tech supply chains, other high-end goods, things like electric vehicles, lithium-ion batteries, semiconductors. Those are the products that also have a pretty globalized supply chain.
We've increasingly seen a convergence of commercial technologies and defense technologies and national security related technologies. We have huge vulnerabilities because of those dependencies on China.
Many experts worry that China's control over the supply of key minerals could put the U.S. at a disadvantage.
Exhibit A in that today would be rare earth materials, which are critical for pretty much every high technology application, from smartphones to electric cars to military applications of all sorts. China is the source of 80+% of the rare earth production in the world, not because rare earths are actually all that rare, but because the mining of them is very dirty and environmentally damaging, and the Chinese have been more willing to do this than other countries.
In 2010, they basically cut off our supplies of rare earths. That's a vulnerability that we have to address. These are the sorts of determinations that we have to make, partly at a political level, partly at an economic level, to determine how much we need to return to the United States.
American politicians from both parties have also tried to challenge China's dominance in the manufacture of solar panels.
This is for solar products, so that we'll be making solar products now, much more so in the United States. Our companies have been decimated, and those companies are going to be coming back strong.
But the parts that go into solar panels are produced by a complex global supply chain.
What we've witnessed in the United States since the tariffs have been implemented on solar panels is a corollary implication for a rise in cost for some of those domestic producers. The business of developing the solar industry here becomes very complex if you're not able to import low-cost products. One solar industry body actually posits that these tariffs, which have been implemented, have starved the US industry of 62,000 jobs and $19 billion in capital.
We can argue on the one hand, maybe it's not a good thing that we have all the solar panels being made in China. But on the other hand, unless we're able to replicate that scale and capacity in another country or in the United States, it's very hard to argue against the positive side of it, which is a huge drop in solar prices.
As trade tensions with China grow, experts debate to what extent concerns about China can be mitigated by diversifying supply chains to other countries.
China is no longer the lowest wage economy in the world, and so people have been moving factories out of China and into Vietnam, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Mexico, and so there has been a natural diversification as people move away from China. I think that's healthy.
You can expect to see a diversification of supply chains moving forward. But one thing I will say about China is that there are many companies that are still engaged in China and indeed even increasing their investments in Chinese manufacturing. But it's primarily because of the growth of the domestic Chinese consumer.
You may not be able to have your full supply chain in your country, but if you're going to have it in another country, you want it to be one where there is geographic proximity. So in our case, we'll probably have more supply chains closer in Mexico or in Canada when they can't be in the US.
The best answer is to diversify, is to have a supply chain that is all over the world so that companies and governments don't depend on input that comes from one country or from one region.
With the most acute disruptions of the early COVID-19 pandemic in the rearview mirror, experts question whether the measures put in place to mitigate its effects might have enduring consequences for the world economy.
In the early phase of the pandemic, there was this huge scramble for medical supplies. Quite a large number of countries imposed some sorts of export restrictions on those. Those kinds of restrictions have largely faded away in terms of importance because we don't have this big shortage of medical supplies anymore.
There are restrictions that have been ongoing and intensifying even before COVID. And that may not change even when COVID is resolved.
Many countries already have restrictions on the export or even import of national security intensive goods or goods that are regarded as being important to national security. In the moment, they're a temporary expedience, but I think the experience of the pandemic is almost certainly going to lead many countries, including the United States, to try to impose more serious restrictions.
In a broader sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has magnified long-standing frustrations with an economy built on global trade.
What was happening before coronavirus was this move toward protectionism, move toward self-reliance, the tariff war, the trade war. And then on top of that came COVID. So that just added to the problems.
Free trade was in trouble before COVID. Many Americans and many people around the world were beginning to question the merits of free trade and whether free trade has indeed provided economic benefits to all members of its societies. But there is no doubt that COVID has accelerated concerns about free trade.
At a time when the benefits and drawbacks of trade have become a contentious part of the national political debate, some observers now wonder whether the era of free trade is over.
There's no question that the benefits of globalization are under fundamental attack. From the perspective here in the United States, we were winners for a long time. The last 30 years or so, relatively speaking, we've been the losers. Other countries are gaining more from trade than we are. I think what we're seeing is a partial turning inward, perhaps a correction from maybe a period in which we were over-globalized, somewhat too dependent on imports in a variety of different places.
Obviously, there's been a disillusionment with the most extreme manifestations of free trade, but I don't think that the American public is buying this. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. If we're becoming more and more efficient in manufacturing goods with fewer workers, the only way we can expand jobs is to open markets around the world.
They say it's a matter of time, 1,000 days and the sun won't shine before I come back to you.
Analysts are eager to draw attention to the work behind the scenes that, despite the upheavals and uncertainties of the pandemic, has kept hospitals supplied and supermarkets stocked.
The U.S. supply chain for pharmaceutical-based products is unparalleled in the world. It is really the gold standard. Although the pandemic has stressed our system, it has remarkably held up very, very well to these stresses.
I will say that the private sector has done quite an amazing job to be able to get the supplies that we have today. And if you go to a grocery store, you'll see some out of stocks, but it is quite an accomplishment that you see the number of products that are there. And in order for those products to get there, there had to have been a tremendous amount of work and rework on a supply chain.
Around the world, consumers have become accustomed to the advantages of an economic system that has become astonishingly efficient. Cheaper goods, bigger selections, and faster delivery. But economic interdependence brings new risks. The hard-learned lessons of the COVID pandemic will loom large in the years to come as policymakers, economists, and business leaders work to prepare for the next great crisis.
Nothing's going to stop me. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way. I go solo. Oh, I go solo. I'm making my way home. I'm making my way.
Great Decisions is America's largest discussion program on global affairs. Discussion groups meet online via Zoom and Google Meets, in person at community centers, libraries, places of worship, and homes across the country to discuss global issues with their community. Participants read the 8-topic briefing book, meet to discuss each topic, and complete a ballot which shares their views with Congress. To start
Russell, you may start.
Well, thank you. Thank you, and good evening to everybody. Thank you for joining us for what I think is an extraordinarily important conversation. We almost had our own supply chain disruption very early on, but we worked that out, got the video up, and I think after you've seen that, you'll see just how important the supply chain is. You know, in talking to people who are involved every day in supply chain management for the last 30 years or more, if I learned nothing else, it's that the supply chain is one of the most important, if not the most important things in the life of every American, and quite frankly, of everybody in the world. And you know, until relatively recently, let's face it, many of us didn't even realize there was such a thing as a supply chain. We certainly didn't realize the complexity and fragility of this thing that is responsible for everything that's planned and sourced and made and transported and warehoused and ultimately put on a shelf somewhere for us to take possession of. Everything depends on the supply chain working seamlessly, as I think you saw in the video. And yet disruption does threaten every touch point in the chain. And the results of a breakdown in the supply chain range from annoyance to devastating catastrophe. You know, it's one thing to receive your UPS package days late, or maybe not even at all. It's quite another to face food and fuel insecurity. It's bad enough for toilet paper to run scarce in a pandemic. It's quite a different thing if the pharmaceutical pedigree has been tainted or national defense and intelligence gathering software has been compromised in some way or another. Well, this evening we have someone who has truly been on the front lines of what we might call supply chain integrity and share with us, speak to us about this important issue. I'd like to introduce Dr. Orit Frankel and say just a few words about her. So permit me, if you will, read a few highlights of her career. Dr. Frankel is the co-founder, as Joyce said, of the American Leadership Initiative. The vision of that organization is to bring about U.S. global leadership through what ALI calls smart, robust diplomacy, development, and trade policies. That's as opposed to the go-it-alone nationalist approach that we've seen now for several years. Dr. Frankel leads all aspects of ALI's programs and policy development. Prior to founding ALI, Dr. Frankel was a senior executive with the General Electric Company for quite a number of years. There, she was responsible for supporting GE's international sales, policy objectives, government relations, and corporate social responsibility initiatives. This is key. Among other things, she led GE's policy and transactions in China for more than 26 years. So no doubt she's got valuable information she can impart to us tonight about the supply chain and China, how that affects things. She was involved in dealing with China's indigenous innovation policies. Also, she may be able to speak to us about China's Belt and Road Initiative, about its strategy. Her career began in the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, where she was the Director for Trade in High Technology Products and Deputy Director for Trade with Japan. Many of you will remember Congressman Lee Hamilton. Well, she worked with the congressman during his time as chair of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Dr. Frankel is also the president of Frankel Strategies, a consulting firm that specializes in Asia policy, not just China, of course, market access issues, and international trade. She's published widely, quite a number of things. She's an adjunct fellow with the Center on Strategic and International Studies, and she served on the board of numerous trade organizations and the Department of Commerce and state advisory panels. But most importantly, Dr. Frankel is our honored guest, and we welcome her to the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg. Dr. Frankel.
Thank you, Russell and Joyce. It's a privilege to be here. I enjoyed seeing the film in large part because I knew quite a few friends who were talking. I worked with Wendy Cutler for many years, and I know Rufus Yerxa, and I know Ted Alden very well. So it was nice to see them. I think the film certainly touched on a lot of really important and complicated and challenging issues that a lot of us are really trying to work through. I think, as the film pointed out, and I was with GE when China joined the World Trade Organization, and I think a lot of us at the time thought that bringing China into kind of the international fold, you sort of forget that for many years, there wasn't a lot of interaction with China. And I think that many people thought that bringing them into the international community would really kind of ultimately set them on a path to kind of playing by the rules that the rest of the world is working with, and ultimately even lead to democracy. And I think while China has come a very, very, very long way in the past 20 years, I think a lot of us have realized that they have a fundamentally different system, and they're happy with that system, and they're not really going to evolve into a more Western-oriented democracy. There's still a very, very, autocratic system. And while they have there's a lot of free market aspects to the way they conduct their economy, it's still in many ways very centrally directed. And the government, it's all, they don't have very many actual private, I don't know that any of their companies are actually private. Most of their companies are large state-owned enterprises that the government directs and subsidizes in a big way. And even the so-called more private companies don't have a completely free and open rein on what they do. And what kind of a tactic they've used for many years is really, they obviously have an enormously large economy, and 1.3 billion people, largest population in the world. So they have a very, very, very large domestic market. And I give you it as an example. GE makes wind turbines, and early in the 90s, GE sold or joint ventured with China on wind turbines, and really licensed them with a lot of the technology. And somewhat after that, after a few years, they closed their market and decided that China would only buy from local wind manufacturers. And at the beginning, it was very, very difficult for them because they weren't very proficient at that. And there were a lot of stories of, lots of windmills lying around that weren't connected to the grid and that broke very easily, et cetera. But over time, they became much better. And after about a dozen years of keeping their market closed, they opened it. But at that point, they were extremely competitive. And they had used the fact that they were, had kind of nurtured their companies in a closed market, in a very large closed market. And those companies then began selling pretty aggressively overseas, which they could do because they had large subsidies from the government. And so eventually what GE found was that they were getting enormous competition from China in countries like, whether it's Nigeria or Brazil or, Indonesia, but all around the developing world. And just to your point of Belt and Road, one of the strategies that China has used is very aggressive financing. And so, we would have many countries come and say to us, well, we'd rather buy your product because we know that your product is better, it's cleaner. You actually employ locals and train them, whereas the Chinese frequently bring in their own workers. And you engage more, you contribute to the community. But frankly, China is giving it to us for no cost, no money down financing for 15 years. Can you match that? No, we can't match that. If you're a profit-making company, you can't match the terms, the government subsidized terms, that they are offering. So, we see that now going on in many, many sectors. And of particular concern is in the digital sector. So, in the technology sector, we're seeing it a lot. You've probably heard a lot about Huawei. And it's very much the same thing where they are very aggressive with selling their technology around the world, particularly in the developing world, but also, in Europe and other places. But they offer terms that are very, very, very hard for commercial companies to match. So that's been a huge issue. And then, of course, if you layer onto that the national security concerns, that when China sells, particularly technology products, they bring with it, monitoring and censorship and cyber issues, et cetera. I think it's a big concern. I think as the film laid out, certainly there's a lot of thinking now around certainly technology products, 5G. What are the technologies that we really need to identify as key technologies that we want to protect? And I think, as the film mentioned, you can't really cut off trade with China, nor would it be desirable on any number of levels. But you want to identify what are the key products that are essential for you to have capability to make in the United States, and that for national security reasons, you may not want to supply to China or have China supply to the US. So we've now added, I think, a lot of medical products to the list of what people consider national security. And I don't think that means that we make everything exclusively in the US. I don't think that's possible, but it does mean that we need to have the capability to do that in the United States. And it means that we certainly shouldn't be relying on one source of supply. It means that should we ever have a pandemic again, or some other kind of situation, that we're able to rely on our own needs, and ramp up manufacturing very, 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 domestic manufacturing very, very quickly. So I think ideally you don't want the list to be huge. I disagree with the person who mentioned, does it include food? And I think, look, the US is one of the largest agricultural producers in the world. And, we have enough to feed ourselves by far. Do we have all food products in the US? No. Does it mean that you can't get grapes in December or, all sorts of fruits year round? Yes. I mean, if we, so I think the issue isn't that we should strive to produce everything domestically. I think we need to trade in food. But if we needed to survive on what we produced domestically, we could definitely do that. I mean, the flip side is that China is an enormous market for US agriculture. And I think it's the largest market for soybeans in the world, and many other products that US manufacturers export, beef, pork. Many of those ag manufacturers were hit very hard by the tariff war between the US and China. which I think was kind of ill-directed. And what you had happen was the president applied a lot of tariffs to China because they weren't complying with what the trade practices he wanted, but they retaliated and imposed tariffs on us. And what happens is that when our soybean manufacturers can't export to China, this is the problem with what we call unilateral sanctions. Other people move in, right? So Brazil was like, hey, hey China, we're going to send you soybeans, and so other countries jump in, and then it becomes harder down the line for the U.S. to reclaim that market. So I think one of the big lessons, and certainly in dealing with China, is working with our allies and not being unilateral, addressing things together. And I think similarly on supply chain, we need to think through what we want to supply domestically, but also work with some of our allies in particular, like some of the Europeans and other, Japan, other countries that we consider strong allies, to kind of come up with some joint plans as well, so that we're not just doing everything unilaterally. So I think that's one of the things. I think the other thing is, as the film showed, supply chains have become incredibly complicated, and it's very, 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 very hard to unwind some of that. So I don't think a decoupling from China is doable or desirable. And I don't think it's possible to undo the supply chain. I think, as I said, we need to be selective and think about what are our national security products? What do we want to maintain production capability for in the United States? How do we want to protect that? And go from there. I think the other thing we need to do, and I think there's a real change in attitude around this, is so for years the U.S. has really shied away from what I would call industrial policy or government involvement in the market in any way. But I think there's now a lot of agreement that we need to, if we want to foster certain technologies, we really do need government involvement. So for instance, semiconductors is clearly, I think everyone agrees that we need domestic semiconductor capability because they're at the heart of anything electronic. And China was really taking over a lot of semiconductor innovation and manufacturing. And so the US Congress actually in early January passed something called the CHIPS Act, which does several things, but really doubles the amount of federal R&D in semiconductors. It allows tax credits for companies building new semiconductor fabrication facilities. It's sort of a whole host of benefits and incentives for the semiconductor industry. And I think there's a lot of thinking that we need to do that in other areas. I mean, another area that people are looking at is 5G. The US at the moment doesn't have a 5G, doesn't manufacture 5G. And so that puts it at us at a severe disadvantage. So again, I think, what are the things we need to really invest in as a country to make sure we have the capability. So, I mean, in my mind, part of the challenge is trade, but a lot of it is really doubling down on our own competitiveness, which the U.S. sadly has let slide. You know, one of the reasons that we have fallen back is our federal R&D has fallen by about half of what it was about 20 years ago. So we really need to invest more in R&D. We need to invest more in education, particularly STEM and digital education. Obviously, China and many other countries, you know, are investing very heavily in that, and it really surpassed the U.S. And that's something we need to really focus on much more. You know, even things like access to the internet. You know, you hear a lot these days about closing the digital divide. You know, I think you have a surprising number of rural Americans, even some inner city Americans, low income Americans that don't have access to the internet and don't have broadband. You know, we need to invest very heavily. I think today's broadband is like electricity, like the FDR electrical, you know, rural electrification plan. You know, it's not a nice to have, it's a must have. And again, we've seen that really accentuated by COVID, where if you don't have internet, how are you going to work, study, you know, have a doctor's appointment, you know, visit with friends, etc. So it's really become a necessity. So I think we have to invest very heavily in our own competitiveness, in addition to thinking about how to separate or you know, where we want to decouple trade-wise. I see there are a few questions. Should I look at the questions?
There are a few questions, and
Sure.
And we do want to jump right in there. But at moderator's prerogative, I get to ask the first one. So let me just note that Senator Tim Kaine in the video has echoed your sentiments that we really do need to have an initiative here to identify those absolutely essential industries that need to be protected, need to be a focus put on, so that we are not going to have those supply chains disrupted in any manner. I guess the question then is, are you confident that the Biden administration will take some steps toward doing the kind of thing that you and the senator are talking about, identifying those crucial industries and ensuring that we can't be held hostage, you know, or have a situation like a pandemic or whatever that might disrupt those supply chains in the future? How do you feel about the current administration?
I think the administration really, really wants to do all those things, and is off to a good start. I think actually there is pretty much bipartisan agreement on a lot of these issues at this point. I think a lot of people feel that Trump actually correctly identified some of the issues, but probably went about addressing them the wrong way. And so I think for a lot of the things that we're talking about, there's pretty broad support to the right and the left in Congress. So I think it's happily not so controversial. I think where we'll get into controversy is, of course, funding. You know, so that's always a challenge. But I think, you know, like I said, I would very much like to see R&D funding doubled. You know, and I think we're just going to need to do that. And I think in terms of identifying key technologies, I think the administration is going to be very focused on that. I think a lot of members, as I said, on both sides of the aisle, are very much concerned about particularly 5G at this point, and really making sure that, and looking to the future, there are really some technologies coming up that are of even, that are really of great concern, like AI, and facial recognition and things like that. The other thing I should have pointed out is that when we make and sell products, we also sell with it, we also should get involved in the standards around those products. So we need to be more aggressive globally in setting the there are very few standards now around AI or, facial recognition. I mean, those technologies hold potential for enormous benefits, but also, can really be misused, obviously. And so there need to be, the US needs to be a global leader in deciding, in leading kind of the agreement around rules for use of some of these technologies. And if we don't, we abdicate that to China. And they, they've really, particularly over the past 4 years, where the US hasn't taken a leadership role globally, they have really moved into that vacuum. And as I said, they have very different ideas about standards on many of these things. And I think, their vision is more autocratic. And I think we want to put out a vision that is more democratic, that respects human rights, rule of law, things like that.
I have a question that from Kathleen concerning the environment. It says, what do you believe are the most detrimental environmental costs of increasing international trade? And how do those factor into the critical and urgent need to address climate change? I'd be interested, I'm sure everyone's interested in your views on that, particularly since we've been talking about relations with one of the greatest polluters on the planet, China.
Well, I think several things. I think one thing is we should, vis-a-vis China, going back 5 years, we had a robust set of dialogues with China on all kinds of things. We had dialogues with them on trade, we had dialogues on the environment, we had dialogues on health, all sort, national security dialogues, Afghanistan, North Korea, all kinds of things. And those really came to an abrupt halt. And I think it's really essential that we re-engage with them where we can. I mean, we're obviously going to have areas of great disagreement and continued friction, but we also have areas that we can cooperate and collaborate with them on. And I think that's essential. Even in, the depths of the Cold War, where the US was fighting Russia and all over the world, we continue to have talks with them about, and we continue to collaborate on scientific endeavors and things like that. So I think it's important to keep that dialogue going. We don't really want to deteriorate the relationship to deteriorate. And clearly climate, just to your point, is an area of great interest. China is a big time polluter, but they've made enormous strides. I think they've installed just phenomenal amounts of wind and solar. And actually their laws are quite strict at this point. One of their big challenges, they're not putting in new coal, for instance, and haven't for the past number of years. One of their big challenges is that they have a large installed coal base. And, it's going to take, they need to be more aggressive, and it will take a lot of time and focus to replace all those. So everything that they're installing new now is gas or renewable. But what they haven't done is really gone back and, replaced a lot of their old, very dirty coal facilities. But it's something that China has a great interest in, really, because they're getting a lot of pressure from their own population. The smog in China had gotten so bad and was really a huge health hazard. So it's something that they're taking very seriously, and I think they're very open to collaborating with us. In terms of trade, I think one of the things we could do, and this was something that actually I worked on when I was at GE, we were negotiating actually a global agreement to eliminate tariffs on all environmentally friendly products. So, really making it, allowing countries to sell and buy, all sorts of environmentally friendly products without any tariffs, make it as cheap and easy to buy those, to import and buy those products. So that's something that I hope the administration will pick up on. I think beyond that, there is, the U.S. Canada Mexico agreement, USMCA, that was negotiated last year, has in it, and just went into effect in July, actually, has in it some quite stringent environmental provisions. And I think that's a template for future agreements. And I think there's quite strong, certainly among the Dems. I don't think we're going to see future trade agreements negotiated without very, very strong environmental provisions.
Dr. Frankel, we've been speaking about national security, and of course the focus is on our national security, but obviously every country has its own security interest. And one of those things that China is very much concerned about is its own fuel insecurity. So of course they're building pipelines overland, and they're bringing in oil, via ocean, etc., which then leads to the question about their operations in the South China Sea, etc. Are you fearful in any kind of way that there may be military action between this country and China by dint of what they have been doing to essentially sequester, a large portion of the ocean to themselves, principally so they can continue bringing in oil unimpeded? What is your thought?
Yeah, look, the South China Sea issue continues to be an irritant, I think, mostly for many of those countries, whether it's the Philippines or Vietnam or that are bordering and have China sort of encroaching on their maritime rights. I think the U.S. would think long and hard before ever, and avoid at all costs a military confrontation with China, because frankly, it would not be pretty. It would be quite horrible. And I honestly think China, would not want that either. So I think both countries would really avoid that at all lengths. I think probably the ultimate challenge to the U.S. would be if China ended up somehow encroaching forcefully on Taiwan, much as they've done with Hong Kong. And I think that would put the U.S. in a difficult position, because we're treaty bound to protect Taiwan. And so if China, I think, militarily became aggressive with Taiwan, that would put the U.S. in a dangerous spot where we'd have to consider military involvement. But beyond something like that, I see the U.S. really trying to avoid any kind of military confrontation with China.
Dr. Frankel, I would love to continue tapping your expertise, quite frankly, and I'm sure many of the people watching tonight feel exactly the same way. And I'm getting a notice from the president here, from Joyce, that it's time to wrap it up. Let me just say, on behalf of the World Affairs Council of Harrisburg, we thank you so very much for your time and your expertise. Thank you. Thank you very much.
You're most welcome. It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. And I guess one final question I would ask, do you see things improving with regard to China's adherence to international law and its reliability as a fair trading partner? Is there any sense that things are actually getting better, that we're being a little unfair with poor old China because it needed time to get on its feet? Can you just address that and then we'll let you go?
Sure. I mean, honestly, I think things did get better with China for quite a while. I think when President Xi took over a few years ago, and then many of the previous Chinese leaders were making moves to kind of open more and introduce more kind of democratic features and engage more with the outside, the international community. And I think she really took a step back. I think there was a little bit of a fear of how far China had gone. And a lot of the population was, becoming very outspoken about wanting more freedoms and things like that. And I think, he's really cracked down. So things have really changed significantly over the past number of years, and in not a good direction. And she actually eliminated term limits, so he's now president for life. So I think, I think on the one hand, China still wants to be a member of the global community. So I don't think they're going to step more out of line than they are. I think they kind of know what the limits are, but I don't see them embarking on I think they have a very different vision for themselves and their economy, and I don't see them moving towards a more, Western approach anytime soon. So.
Well, thank you. We've kept you long enough, but we really do appreciate your taking time. And Russell, thank you for being an excellent moderator. And thanks to our guests, and especially thanks to the Frederickson Library and its patrons for joining us tonight, and all of our friends on Facebook Live. So we'll see you here next week when we'll have another Great Decisions at 7 p.m. See you later, guys. Thank you very much, Dr. Frankel. Bye-bye.
My pleasure. Thank you. Bye-bye.